The night Mara turned 18, her stepfather set her bag on the porch and locked the door behind her.
No shouting, no goodbyes.
Just a click of a deadbolt and the porch light switching off, as if she were a guest who had overstayed a party. She stood on the cracked concrete steps for a long time, waiting for the door to open again. It never did. She had nowhere to go, no savings, and no family left except a name she barely remembered. Grandpa Elias, her mother's father, who had died the winter before. A lawyer's letter had arrived weeks earlier, forgotten in the bottom of her school bag. She dug it out that night under a street lamp and read it twice. He had left her a cabin in the mountains, some 200 miles north, along with a note that said only, "For Mara, when she needs it most." She used her last dollars for a bus ticket. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road so overgrown that the driver refused to go further than the mailbox. Mara walked the last mile in the dark, her sneakers soaked through, her breath fogging in the cold mountain air, until the trees opened onto a clearing and the cabin appeared like something from a memory she didn't know she had. It was small, log-built, with a crooked chimney and moss creeping up one wall, the porch sagging at one corner where the wood had softened. Somewhere in the trees an owl called, and for a moment she almost turned back toward the road, toward a town where at least there were streetlights and strangers. But she had nowhere else to walk to. The key was under a stone shaped like a fox, exactly where the lawyer's letter said it would be, cold and slightly rusted in her palm. Inside, dust lay thick over everything, a wood stove, a narrow bed, shelves of tin cans long past their dates. But it was dry, and it was hers, and for the first time in years, nobody could tell her to leave. She stayed. She found work at a diner in town, 40 minutes by the mail carrier's truck, waiting tables for tips that barely covered gas and groceries, and spent her evenings scrubbing decades of neglect from the cabin's walls and floors. The diner's owner, an older woman named Ruth, noticed the bruises of exhaustion under Mara's eyes and never asked questions, only packed extra biscuits into her bag at closing time. Mara learned to chop wood without splitting her knuckles, to patch a roof before the first hard rain, to stretch a dollar further than she'd ever thought possible, to live on very little and still feel, for the first time, that the little she had belonged entirely to her. The cabin became less of a shelter and more of a life, its walls slowly losing their layer of dust under her hands. It was in her third month, while repairing a water-stained wall in the back room, that she found the seam. The wood paneling didn't quite match the boards around it, a rectangle, no bigger than a cabinet door, fitted so precisely that only weeks of staring at every inch of the room, sanding and restaining board by board, let her notice it at all. Her fingers traced the outline once, twice, half convinced she was imagining things. But the hairline gap was real, too straight and too deliberate to be a flaw in the timber. She pried at the edge with a flathead screwdriver, working it slowly so as not to splinter the old wood, until it gave all at once, swinging open like a hidden door on a hinge no one had oiled in 20 years. Behind it was a cavity built into the wall itself, lined with cedar to keep out damp. Inside sat a metal strongbox, a bundle of letters tied with twine gone brittle, and a leather journal with her grandfather's initials burned into the cover. Her hand shook as she lifted the strongbox onto the bed. It wasn't locked. Inside were stacks of old bonds, a small velvet pouch of coins that looked older than the cabin itself, and a folded deed to a second parcel of land she had never heard of, 40 acres bordering a lake, in her name, dated the year she was born. The letters were from her grandmother, who had died before Mara was old enough to remember her voice. They were written to Elias during the years he worked away from home, and buried in them was a story nobody had ever told her, that her mother had once run from the same family, young and frightened, and that Elias had spent the rest of his life trying to build something that would still be standing when someone finally needed to come back to it. "I am building a place that cannot be taken away," one letter read, in her grandmother's looping hand. "No one can lock a door on land that is already yours." The journal explained the rest. Elias had watched his daughter, Mara's mother, drift further from him over the years, swallowed by a marriage he never trusted and a household he was rarely welcome inside. There were entries about phone calls that went unreturned, about a granddaughter he saw only twice before she turned 10, about the quiet grief of loving people who kept moving further out of reach. Somewhere in those pages, the tone shifted from sorrow into resolve. He wrote about a promise he made himself late one winter, sitting alone in this very cabin, that if the day ever came when the family turned its back on one of its own, there would be a door already open for them, waiting, patient, regardless of how long it took. He had hidden the deed and the savings in the wall not out of secrecy for its own sake, but caution, afraid that if his daughter's husband ever learned of it, the money would vanish into debts that were never Mara's to pay, swallowed the way everything else in that house seemed to be. Mara sat on the floor of that small room until the candle burned low, reading her grandfather's handwriting by its shrinking light, understanding for the first time that she had not simply inherited a cabin. She had inherited a plan, one built years before she was ever thrown out onto a porch, as if he had somehow known this exact night was coming. The bonds took months to cash, working with a small-town lawyer who remembered Elias fondly and helped her navigate paperwork she didn't understand. The lakefront land turned out to be worth more than she ever imagined, wooded and quiet, with a view that made even skeptical buyers stop talking. She didn't sell it. Instead, she used part of the Strongbucks' savings to repair the cabin properly. New roof, real plumbing, a wood stove that didn't leak smoke into the room, and kept the rest for the life she was only just beginning to build. She never went back to the house she'd been thrown out of. She heard, secondhand, that her stepfather asked around town about her once, after word got out that she'd inherited land worth something. She didn't answer his calls. Some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. At night, she sometimes sat in that back room, in front of the wall that had once hidden a stranger's fortune and turned out to hide the truest inheritance of all, the certainty that someone, long before she needed it, had loved her enough to make sure she would never truly be without a home again. The cavity in the wall stood empty now, its cedar lining bare, but she left the little door unlocked, a habit she couldn't quite break. It felt right, somehow, to leave a door in their house open, when so many others in her life had been slammed shut. People in town began to call her the girl who rebuilt the mountain cabin, though few of them knew the real story behind it. Mara let them wonder. Some nights, when the wind moved through the pines the way it must have when her grandfather sat alone building his quiet plan year after year, she thought she understood him completely, a man who couldn't undo the choices of the people he loved, but who could still leave behind proof that not every door in the world closes for good. She kept one of her grandmother's letters framed above the wood stove, the one with the line about locked doors, its brittle paper protected now behind a pane of glass she'd bought in town for exactly that purpose. It was the first thing visitors saw when they stepped inside, and the last thing Mara saw each night before she blew out the lamp and climbed into the same narrow bed her grandfather must have slept in decades before her. Sometimes, in the hush before sleep, she thought about the version of herself who had stood shivering on a locked porch, believing that night marked the end of something. It hadn't. It had only been the beginning of a door swinging open somewhere far away, in a wall she hadn't even known existed yet. Thrown out at 18 with nothing but a bus ticket and a folded letter, she had somehow ended up exactly where her grandfather intended. Not just surviving, but rooted, in a home built long before she knew she would need it, waiting patiently behind a wall for the day she finally came looking. And whenever new guests arrived at the little lakeside cabins bearing her grandmother's name, tired and uncertain the way she had once been, Mara made a point of telling them the same thing Ruth had never needed to say to her, that whatever door had closed behind them, another one, somewhere, was almost certainly still open. They rarely believed her at first, arriving with the same tired disbelief she once carried up that gravel road. But then, she reminded herself, neither had she, not until the night she found the door.